Hey, shalom, shalom, shalom lakam, which is peace unto you all. Hayawam tawab la atham. Za yakam yawam or Hagadol, Charlotte, which is good evening, good day. This is your brother Yawam from the GMS camp in Charlotte. Nachamatam kaya. Hamalakath Hashemayim Kwa Rab, repent ye for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Call Layim La La Abanaw Yahweh Bahasham Yahweh Shai. Bahasham Racha Hakodash Wamashana Laza Konim Yahweh. Wamalakim Shar Racha Gadol, which is all praises to our Father Yahweh, which means he exists. Bahasham, in the name Yahweh Shai, delivers in double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. This is an article on foxbusiness.com, and it says Trump administration taps automakers to boost weapons production in WW2 style push. It says senior defense officials discuss producing munitions and war materials with top executives from several companies. All right, in which munitions goes into things like, war supplies, if I'm not mistaken, like, artillery rounds, regular, small arms rounds and stuff like that, So essentially what's going on is that WW3, all right, World War III, to where ultimately in the end, all right, ICBM nuclear missiles are going to be used. All right, but right now we in a time to where the Lord ultimately is gathering, the nations for that third world's woe. All right. But continuing on, it says the Trump administration is turning to automakers and U.S. manufacturers to ramp up weapons production in WW2 style push. A Pentagon official confirmed to Fox Business. It says the Department of War is committed to rapidly expanding the defense industrial base by leveraging all available commercial solutions and technologies to ensure our warfighters maintain a decisive advantage. A Pentagon official told Fox Business. The department is aggressively pursuing and integrating the best of American innovation wherever it resides to deliver production at scale and drive resiliency across supply chains, the official added. Senior defense officials have discussed producing weapons and other military supplies with top executives from several companies, including General Motors and Ford Motor, according to WSJ, which cited people familiar with the discussions. The outlet reported that the Pentagon is considering having the companies use their personnel and factory capacity to ramp up production of munitions and other war materials as conflicts in Ukraine and Iran continue. So pretty much, if they don't have somebody, if they didn't hire anybody that is well versed, all right, in weapons type of materials, all right. Because they said, I'm reading again, it says the outlet reported that the Pentagon is considering having the companies use their personnel and factory capacity to ramp up production of munitions. All right, so just regular, it's from the sounds of it, it sounds like they're going to be using regular everyday type people, to mass produce, the materials that they need, in which in the U.S. military, all right, a lot of things are deadline meaning that, all right, it's no longer operable, all right. And then also, they're under recruiting and retention, so they're going to have to bring a draft. All right. And the draft is going to bring, all right, people that's not necessarily ready for battle. All right. As they did, in times past, where they got two schools basically to where, you got they got basic training. All right. And then after that, they got the job school. But pretty much it was a time in history, in U.S. history, to where they just went to basic training and then they just threw them on the front lines. So it's going to be a lot of underdeveloped leaders and a lot of underdeveloped workers under those leaders. All right. And just going into this, they could have, war materials that's not up to the standards, being that they already don't have the money to be able to fund the war. And then also they don't have the money to ultimately have a good enterprise, a good corporation, because America Babylon the Great is just a big corporation. All right. And it runs off of predominantly from being that hammer of the earth, and then also America, or in cooperation with that, in conjunction with that, they also was able to benefit off of the traffic, the merchandise, and being a big corporation. But nobody wants to do business as America once did, So those old tricks of the trade is no longer working, So they're having to ultimately turn to other avenues. All right, but nevertheless, continuing on, it says GE Aerospace and vehicle and machinery maker Oshkosh also reportedly held talks with defense officials, according to the Journal. All right, and I'm gonna read a little bit more, but it says The talks come as the military seeks to increase production of munitions and tactical hardware, including missiles and counter-drone technology, the report said. Defense officials said accelerating weapons production is being treated as a matter of national security, according to the report. So they're having to accelerate the production of weapons. So if you got to work faster, it's not going to come out, how something that the time was placed upon it. All right, is having to be accelerated. So that can increase, human error. All right, and it can also pretty much in that process, things can be made cheaply, being that it has to the acceleration of the weapons has to be they have to be produced faster, being that the U.S. is being squeezed into this war. But it says defense officials said accelerating weapons production is being treated as a matter of national security. According to the report, officials also asked companies to identify barriers to taking on additional defense work, including contracting requirements and challenges with the bidding process. The Pentagon's recent budget request of $1.5 trillion includes funding for munitions and drone manufacturing. In a statement provided to Fox Business, Oshkosh said it brings the full strength of a global enterprise combining scale, financial stability, and advanced flexible manufacturing to efficiently ramp production while delivering consistent quality and reliability for both commercial and military customers. We are committed to regularly evaluating how our available capacity can meet the Department of War's evolving needs, and we are proud to support national defense and the service members who rely on our capabilities and technologies, a spokesperson said. All right, so this country is in a time of war. All right, the earth is in a time of war. Everybody is choosing their sides. All right, so let's get a couple precepts. This is Isaiah Yeshaya chapter 13 and verse 4. And it says, the noise of a multitude in the mountains, like as of a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts mustered the hosts of the battle. All right, I'm going to read down in verse 6. It says, they come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. Reading it again. Isaiah 13 and 5, it says, they come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. All right, so going into verse 4, ultimately it's the Lord that is putting it on the minds of these kings to, get lockstep with each other. They're making those backdoor deals, all right, behind America, Babylon the Greats. They're pretty much unaware, all right, as the scriptures go into in Isaiah the 33rd chapter and Obadiah. All right, ultimately the other nations is pretty much teaming up together, all right, because they have a vendetta against this place. All right, the nations are mad as pursuant to Jeremiah the 51st chapter, and America has broke different agreements that they had with these nations and with their allies, so to speak. So their allies are feeling a certain type of way, and some of them by default they just have to make a decision to side with China and Russia, like Europe, for instance. So reading this again, Isaiah 13 and 4 says, the noise of a multitude in the mountains, like as of a great people, a tumultuous noise of the kingdoms of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts mustered the hosts of the battle. So the Lord is ultimately gathering, all right, the nations together. It says they come from a far country, from the end of heaven, even the Lord and the weapons of his indignation to destroy the whole land. So the weapons of the Lord is ultimately going into the ICBM nuclear missiles. They're going to have the Lord's spirit placed upon them. All right, 200 million nuclear warheads, But let's also get this. Let's get Isaiah Yeshaya chapter 33, and we'll get verse 1. It says, subtitle in the BLB, the judgment of the Most High. It says, woe to thee that spoilest, and thou wast not spoiled. All right, talking about America, Babylon the Great, from how they ultimately make these deals. All right, but then in they mind, they have spoiling. They'll say, all right, in Afghanistan, it's weapons of mass destruction. All right, but ultimately they want to spoil the lands of the inhabitants of that land. All right, to ultimately get some type of resource. All right, but it says, woe to thee that spoilest, and thou wast not spoiled, and dealest treacherously, and they dealt treacherously, and they dealt not treacherously with thee. All right, and again, America will make these different agreements. All right, but then on the same hand, on the opposite side, they ain't pulling their end of the bargain. You know, they pretty much, you know, lying in, you know, different agreements, different peace treaties, and so on and so forth with people that they ultimately have diplomacy with. You know, they ultimately taking things upon themselves. They're ultimately again, you know, looking out after themselves. All right, and that's why the other nations don't want to have anything to do with America. All right, but it says when thou shalt cease to spoil, thou shalt be spoiled. And when thou shalt make an end to deal treacherously, they shall deal treacherously with thee. And that's essentially, you know, what's happening. You know, the other nations, you know, they're tired of America, Babylon, the great shit, you know, so they ultimately taking matters into their own hands and making different agreements, you know, with like countries like Russia, China, you know, North Korea. All right, this is Obadiah chapter 1, and we'll get verse 7. And it says, all the men of thy confederacy have brought thee even to the border. The men that were at peace with thee have deceived thee and prevailed against thee. They that eat thy bread have laid a wound under thee. There is none understanding in him. You know, let's get this in the NLT. And it says, all your allies will turn against you. They will help to chase you from your land. They will promise you peace while plotting to deceive and destroy you. Your trusted friends will set traps for you and you won't even know about it. And that's essentially America, Babylon the Great. You know, ultimately, they played the part of the hammer. All right, America, Babylon the Great was that hammer. All right, mentioned in the scriptures. All right, but ultimately, you know, from that devastation, when you go into the definition of a hammer, it's a devastator. You know, it goes into devastation. All right, but they play the devastator. All right, and the devastator ultimately spoils. All right, and how America, Babylon the Great has ultimately got a lot of the riches that it has received. All right, is from that traffic, from that merchandise, and in that business. Ultimately, it's been a lot of treaties, agreements, and things that America has said that they were going to do, but they didn't really, you know, hold their end, you know. So let's get Jeremiah chapter 50, and we'll get This is Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 21. And it says, go up against the land of Marathayam, even against it, and against the inhabitants of Pakwawad, waste and utterly destroy after them, saith the Lord, and do according to all that I have commanded thee. All right, so Marathayam, that goes into double rebellion. All right, so America has, you know, sins that, you know, reach to the skies. You know, the Lord is ultimately, the Lord has his eyes on America, Babylon the Great. You know, this place is known as double rebellion. All right, and it's also spiritual. It says another name for Babylon. It's also spiritual, that it's double rebellion. It's the same word for bitterness. You know, so for that double rebellion, all right, well, America's going to receive a double bitterness. All right, the ICBM nuclear missiles, and then the plagues is ultimately happening as we speak. All right. So I'm gonna get one more, and that'll be it. Let me see. This is 2nd Esdras chapter 16, and we'll get verse 33. And it says, the virgin shall mourn, having no bridegrooms. The women shall mourn, having no helper. Excuse me. The virgin shall mourn, having no bridegrooms. The women shall mourn, having no husbands. Their daughters shall mourn, having no helpers. In the war shall their bridegrooms be destroyed, and their husbands shall perish of famine. All right. And ultimately, you know, in these times, you know, we see, you know, we got that article on Fox Business. It went into how they're using, you know, the different car companies to ultimately make weapons productions. All right. For the military, for this Third World War. All right. Also, they talked about in the recent past, all right, going into, you know, a draft, you know, because this 2026, all right, in December, you know, they're going to automatically, you know, pretty much put people into men. It's going to be women too, but, you know, right now it's starting with men, all right, 18 to 26, because at first they left it up to, you know, the person, if they was 18 or 18, you had to do the selective service, but it's no longer like selective service as it once was. All right, as to where they automatically putting people into, you know, a drafting pool, you know, so this country is getting prepared for war, and rightfully so, you know, because this is, you know, one of those things. All right, some of that burden that this place didn't look forward to. All right, I'm gonna get that. I'm gonna go ahead and close, but this is Isaiah chapter 13, and we'll get verse 1. Isaiah 13 and 1, and it says, the burden of Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amos did see. Let's get Isaiah the 19th chapter. Isaiah 19 and verse 1, it says, the burden of Egypt, behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence, and the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. All right, in which we got Isaiah 13 and 1. It said the burden of Babylon. All right. America, Babylon the Great is known as Babylon, Egypt, Nineveh. All right. Spiritually, you see, because it takes on the characteristics, all right, and the works of these places. All right, Babylon, confusion. This is the land of confusion. All right? It's also known as the melting pot. All right, and with the melting pot comes a melting pot of philosophies, lifestyles, and so on and so forth that can be found in America. All right, but then also it goes into Egypt. All right, Egypt, the land of sodomy. All right, and those weird altered ways of living. All right, but I wanted to get these two scriptures ultimately because when you go into this word for burden, it says mash'ah. All right, and it says bearing tribute. It says that which is carried or bought or borne. It says utterance, oracle. All right, it says chiefly a doom right here. All right, it says mental. All right, because ultimately they didn't lay this to mind. All right, those that ultimately took on the ways of America, Babylon the Great, and those that run this place, they didn't consider, ultimately what they will receive of from subscribing to those ways of life. All right. But reading this back, Isaiah 19 and 1, it says, behold, the Lord rideth upon a swift cloud, and shall come into Egypt, and the idols of Egypt shall be moved at his presence. All right, the Lord Yahweh is dispatching his son Yahweh Shai, all right, upon the fathership. All right, and the idols of Egypt, all right, those things that people confided in, all right, in present Egypt, all right, America, all right, those idols are being removed, all right, from the femininity, the feminism, all right, the money, the economy, the jobs, degrees, all right, and whatever it is in America that people confided in, and the idols that it goes back to, all right, those things are being moved, all right, they're being shown of no worth. It says, in the heart of Egypt shall melt in the midst of it. All right, the American dream is no more. All right, those are ultimately they're comprising the plagues that the Lord has sent upon this place. All right, and that ultimately is, again, that represents, all right, that goes into, what the people of America, didn't consider. They didn't consider that they would be judged, for the things that they have wrought, or they didn't consider that they would be judge, for their conversation, for how they carried themselves, 2/3 and the heathen, so just wanted to go into that, you see, because we are in the time of war, and we're also chiefly, we're going into prophecy, we're in the time of prophecy. Prophecy is jumping off the pages, all right, and ultimately it is manifest, and everybody's feeling it, so I don't want to Zabanaya Apollo is with us, a beautiful edification to the spirit. Water to Zah, Tham Yeshua Wam Tawab. Lord's will, you have a good day. Wa shalom lakam, which peace to you all. Shalom, shalom.